my dear friends, and welcome back. This is our special series on Napoleon's last campaign. Many of you have no doubt already guessed that there must be other episodes preceding this one. Please see the links in the description box below. In our previous video, we left Napoleon on the morning of June 18th, 1815, near the village of La Belle Alliance, while Marshal Ney just happened to ride on top of the ridge, which offered him a splendid view of the Anglo-Dutch deployment. And what he saw delighted him, as the salvation of France was on the horizon. He saw carts and wagons and rows upon rows of injured soldiers limping behind the ridges or being carried by their tired comrades. What he saw gave him no time for contemplation, since he was sure that Wellington was in retreat. And since he already messed up badly at Quatre Bras by letting Wellington retreat unharmed, he wasn't about to make the same mistake twice.
He won't make the same mistake twice.
Instead, he made a different one. Marshal Ney was a great leader who rarely second-guessed himself. And so, he ordered a large-scale cavalry attack, which was consistent with the rock-paper-scissors rules of military engagements at the time. The problem was that the British didn't retreat. So, almost 900 glamorous-looking cuirassiers in their distinctive breastplates charged the British lines between Hougomont and La Haye-Sainte. Wave after wave, more and more horsemen joined the attack. As the first wave reached the enemy line, they saw the abandoned British cannons and groups of wounded Allied soldiers hurriedly retreating from the ridge. Marshal Ney was right after all. But they also saw at least 20 British squares ready to fight. And the guns had been abandoned only temporarily, so the gunners could hide inside the squares. So now, they had a cavalry's worst nightmare. Instead of chasing the retreating army, they had to charge the squares. In the recorded history of warfare, there were only a handful of times when cavalry was able to break the squares, and usually because the soldiers forming the squares broke the formation themselves. As long as the square remained intact, the cavalry had almost no chance. The only way to succeed was to be supported by close-range cannons, using canister shots or grape shots, as well as the infantry, which could attack in lines, while the threat of a cavalry attack would prevent the squares from unfolding into lines and receive the enemy infantry attack properly. But in order to have the slower-moving infantry assist the cavalry, Marshal Ney would have to wait, which he didn't want to do, as he was sure the British were retreating. Thus, he sent the cavalry unsupported. With over 5,000 cavalry attacking the British squares, Ney was hopeful that one by one those squares would collapse. But they didn't. Instead, they destroyed the most beautiful troops in Napoleon's possession. But how? It's all about geometry. The average British battalion contained 500 men, creating a square made of about 120 soldiers, forming 4 rows. The first row kneels, with their bayonets pointing out. The second row crouches, with their bayonets also extended outwards, forming a deadly porcupine of sorts, like in our first episode. And that porcupine was spitting fire on all sides, as the 2 upper rows of soldiers on each side of the square were tasked with firing on the oncoming horsemen. Each side would be about 30 men wide, or 55 feet. So, the key question here is how many cavalrymen could attack the face of a square at the same time? Since the horseman needs much more space than an infantryman, about 4 feet to be exact, only 14 or 15 of the cavalrymen could charge the face of the square at a time. True, they could come in ranks, but they were up against 60 armed men. They had to wait to fire until they saw the whites of the cavalrymen's eyes, or their horses' eyes, to be exact, since those poor animals presented an easy target. Even if we assume that only 2/3 of the 60 shots would find their targets, a condition which was easily met given the short range and size of the target, all of the men and their horses would be on the ground, causing a natural barrier for the second rank. And even if somehow 1 or 2 attacking horsemen survive, their horses would refuse to charge into a wall of steel, no matter how brave their riders may be. And behind the first row of squares was the second and the third. Basically, Ney had led his cavalry into a maze of death. By the time 8,000 French infantry of General Ray finally caught up with them, there was almost no cavalry to support, and the British squares could, and did, unfold into lines to receive the incoming French soldiers. All was not lost for Napoleon, as his troops were finally able to take possession of the fortified, strategically positioned bastion of La Haye-Sainte. From there, the French gunners were able to offer unexpected close-range support to the French infantry, the same infantry that came in to support the cavalry, only to find no one to support. Close-range bombardment of Wellington's center led to the near collapse of Allied morale. Another alleged mistake of the Prince of Orange led to the destruction of the entire battalion of Allied troops. All that was needed was a couple of battalions of fresh and battle-tested reserves to break the enemy line. And despite the pleas from Marshal Ney, Napoleon refused to send in his precious sons, his Imperial Guards. At the same time, the first Prussian troops were expected to appear on Wellington's left, allowing him to move some of his troops to reinforce the center. Due to Wellington's reinforcements, the Allied line held up. Victory was in Napoleon's grasp, but this was as close to it as the French were able to come. And through it all, Wellington and his brave horse Amsterdam were in the thick of it, commanding, encouraging, and supporting. His calm and confident demeanor encouraged his men, but Wellington was neither calm nor confident.
What are your plans?
To beat the French.
He knew that the only thing that could save him from another crisis in the center was a full-blown attack from the Prussian army. In contrast, Napoleon only appeared once in front of his troops, riding his beautiful Désirée, otherwise outsourcing the operational command to Marshal Ney. And unfortunately for Napoleon, the Prussians were already there. And even more disastrous was the fact that 33,000 French soldiers under Grouchy were stuck fighting rearguard action near Favre, instead of preventing the Prussians from linking up with Wellington, or at least arriving in time to help Napoleon. While the Prussian deployment did take time, finally, General von Bulow's corps, which you may recall was not involved in the Battle of Ligny, advanced towards the village of Plancenoit, which lay behind Napoleon's position, making it massively important to both sides. 31,000 men would attack this strategically important village, which changed hands several times, as the increasingly desperate Napoleon, who couldn't afford to lose it, sent 8 battalions of his immortal Imperial Guards to retake the village. After gaining and losing it several times, the overwhelming advantage of arriving Prussians eventually forced the French out of it, at a tremendous cost to both sides. Now, Napoleon only had 13 battalions of Imperial Guards left in reserve, but he had to send 2 more to prevent a complete encirclement by the Prussian forces. In addition, the First Corps under General von Zieten was supposed to link up with the British-Dutch troops on the ridge further north. And now almost 5,000 of von Zieten's men were marching to back up Wellington, which allowed him to send additional reinforcements to his center. This is where he expected Napoleon's last Hail Mary assault, which is exactly what happened. Bonaparte was indeed running out of time, options, and luck. And now, with the Prussians about to tip the scale, Napoleon relented and decided to launch the best troops in Europe, his Imperial Guards in a last-ditch attempt to break the Anglo-Dutch lines. At 7 p.m. on June 18th, Napoleon literally rolled the dice, which showed an 8. So, he sent 8 battalions, or 5,000 men, of his guards to save France, leaving only 3 in reserve. This number was hopelessly small, but they were the best troops France had, and they were supported by the remnants of the French infantry and cavalry. Napoleon himself led the initial stage of the attack, misleading his men that the new troops arriving from the east were the Frenchmen under Marshal Grouchy. Despite facing daunting firepower, the guards kept pushing, exclaiming, "Vive l'Empereur!"
Vive l'Empereur!
Marching in neither columns nor lines, but in squares, which was possible only for exceptionally well-trained troops. The battle lasted for almost 30 minutes, resulting in enormous casualties on both sides. But the Imperial Guards pushed forward, and with the assistance of the French artillery, they caused panic in the British lines. And then, something happened. As the 4th Chasseurs of the Imperial Guard attempted to spread into a line to press their advantage, the 52nd, the big Oxfordshire battalion, under the command of Sir John Colborne, made themselves famous. Colborne did the unthinkable. He violated the rules of military rock, paper, scissors, and took the 52nd out of a line and marched them forward so they would position themselves along the flank of the French troops, who were trying to reform into lines. The smoke was so thick that the move went unnoticed by the French, until it was too late. Now, I must say that this move was very risky business, as the 52nd was extremely vulnerable to attack, which never came, since the French were dealing with the Allied troops immediately in front of them. When the 52nd was in position to fire, the 4th Chasseurs found themselves attacked on 2 sides, in the middle of a deadly embrace of musket fire. The unbeaten finally broke. They didn't just retreat, they broke. And when they fled, so did the rest of the Imperial Guards. Within minutes, the formidable French army had disintegrated, while the remaining guards offered a heroic but doomed resistance. The rest of the army fled, and so did Napoleon. At the same time, the entire Allied army advanced forward to complete the destruction of the French army. On the 22nd of June, Napoleon abdicated in favor of his son. And on the 4th of July, Paris surrendered to the Allies. And Napoleon spent the last 6 years of his life in exile on the island of St. Helena, in the middle of nowhere. His life left many complicated legacies, among which was his last campaign, which stands as a remarkable textbook example for any military historian. I cannot thank you enough for spending time with me to explore, or to be precise, just to scratch the surface of this terrifying and magnetic military engagement. P.S. It is widely accepted that Napoleon was pretty short.
Short! Why do you look at me when you say short?
But in reality, he and I both stand at around 5'7", which isn't the only similarity between the two of us. Please return for the next episode of the most intriguing military battles.
As Wellington nothing to offer me but these Amazons?